He was the songwriter and lead singer of one of the most influential post-punk bands in history, Joy Division. His creativity, talent, influence and bizarre energy on stage were acclaimed by everyone. However, what was going on backstage and, above all, within the confines of his own mind was being kept in secret obscurity, despite all signs being there. Had his bandmates paid closer attention to the between the lines of the songs he was writing and they were playing at the concerts, and perhaps tragedy could have been avoided. This is the tormented story of Ian Curtis. If, for any reason, you went to visit the facilities of the Employment Exchange of Macclesfield, which is a town in the suburbs of Greater Manchester, England, during the mid to late 70s, there was a good chance you would come across a young, nice-looking, friendly and helpful employee in his mid-20s. His name, Ian Kevin Curtis. His duty? Helping those deemed by society as having special needs to better integrate it in the best way possible. We are talking about those known by a vast plethora of nomenclatures besides the aforementioned one. They are the problematic, the antisocial, the asocial, the sick, the misfits, the weirdos. In summary, the outcasts. They are the ones who, had they been unlucky enough to have been born a few decades earlier in a certain continental European country more to the south, not only their fate would be quite different, but also more than traced. But not in the civilized and humanistic Great Britain of the 1970s, fortunately. So young Ian was paid to help such people find a job. His boss could sometimes find him lazy, distant, uninterested, and with his head totally immersed into his musical dream. However, deep inside, he knew that Ian Curtis was the best employee the office could have for that task. Why? Because Ian Curtis was the living proof right in front of everyone's eyes it was indeed possible for an outcast to get a job. Because the truth is that, ironically, Ian was himself an outcast. He dressed weirdly, he danced weirdly, he acted weirdly, he suffered weirdly, and all of it would soon become like a torture chamber to his sensitive soul. Ian Curtis was born on the 15th of July 1956 at the Stratford Memorial Hospital in Greater Manchester to police officer and amateur writer Kevin Curtis and his wife Doreen, who at that point had been married for 4 years and lived in Huddersfield, a neighborhood in Macclesfield. As a fun fact, the hospital where Ian was born closed its doors in 2015. And since then, the building has been abandoned to the point where rumors started spreading about the place being supposedly haunted. Considering that Ian was born there, I'm a little surprised no one has claimed to have seen the ghost of Ian Curtis wandering around the area. But I better not give anyone any ideas. Before we move on, we need to be fully aware of how life was in Greater Manchester and its surrounding areas when Ian was growing up. Firstly, we must bear in mind that Ian, despite having lived in a few different locations, spent all his short life confined to the environment of this metropolitan area, which pretty much influenced his state of mind the whole time. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, that is, the decades Ian grew up in, Manchester was an area of extensive factory activity, which started as soon as in the 19th century, back when it was a center stage for the development of the textile industry during the Industrial Revolution. As a solid industrial complex in England, a great number of factories in the Manchester area were mobilized during World War II to produce weapons for the British Army, which made it a big target for the Germans. They bombed the area more than once, and the works for its restoration lasted for decades.
not to mention the immense trauma it left on the populations old enough to still remember those times.
During that rebuilding process, Manchester ended up losing a big chunk of its supplying power in terms of fuel and electricity. If, due to its industrial nature, Manchester was already a dark, gloomy, polluted, monotonous, chaotic, and desperate area, with very little to offer in terms of incentives and lights at the end of the tunnel, especially to its younger inhabitants, now it was also being affected by the substantial rise of unemployment, economic crisis, and constant tensions between the workers and the employers.
In other words, Manchester, now reduced to little more than a smoggy jungle of concrete, flooded by acid rains once in a while, was about to lose control.
And this lack of control affected Ian Curtis throughout his entire life. Ian spent his childhood in Hurtsville with his parents and younger sister Carol. From an early age, Ian was already passionate about reading. Besides books, Ian also showed tremendous admiration for the military figure, mainly the military units of ancient Rome and Greece. It wasn't the patently evil and bloody side of war that fascinated young Ian, but rather its vestigial and almost imperceptible good side, that is, the discipline and bravery displayed by the soldiers and, most of all, the simple beauty of their uniforms, faithfully recreated by Ian's colored pencils, while he was bringing back to life countless of those Roman and Spartan soldiers he enjoyed drawing so much. Ian's fascination with the Roman Empire was so intense he would even, as we know, adopt the famous Caesar's haircut as one of his visual trademarks later on, something that would accompany him until the end of his brief life. When he wasn't doing child things alone, Ian Curtis did child things collectively, especially with his neighbor and best friend Tony Nuttall. They'll be BFFs for the next 16 years. In terms of academics, young Ian always excelled as a student, showcasing his high intellect and will to learn. First at Macclesfield's Trinity Square Primary School and then at Hurtsfield Junior High. In the late 60s, when Ian had already entered adolescence, the Curtises would move to a new apartment more centrally located in Macclesfield, more or less coinciding with when Ian won a scholarship to the prestigious King's School of Macclesfield for his secondary studies. It's worth remembering that, especially at this time, only the highest graded students would be granted the privilege of studying there. During his teenage years, while his male peers were clearly more interested in chasing and collecting girls for the we-know-what, Ian seemed more interested in chasing and collecting notable literary works of distinguished authors such as Kafka, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Burroughs, amongst many, many others.
It doesn't mean Ian Curtis didn't also display a few of the typical behaviors of the youth of the proto-punkish scene of the 1970s.
Ian wasn't the typical glass-wearing intellectual easily found walking around the school library or the chemistry lab. It was way easier to spot him in the comfort of his own bedroom, wearing extravagant jackets and applying eyeliner like his great music idols such as David Bowie, Iggy Pop, The Velvet Underground or Roxy Music, while listening to their albums and chain-smoking. The truth is that, besides literature
and military uniforms,
Ian Curtis was also a huge music lover. Speaking yet of idols, Ian also seemed obsessed with celebrities who descended to the grave too soon, such as James Dean, Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin. Plus those who, despite still living among him and the rest of people, were always showing their will to die soon. One of them was his big idol David Bowie himself, who expressed his wish to not live past 25 in the song All the Young Dudes that he wrote for Mott the Hoople. Even when Ian was still alive, he was already feeling betrayed by Bowie, who was around that age when he wrote the song and, as we all know perfectly well nowadays, ended up living way more than that.
Do what I say, don't do what I do. When Ian wasn't busy doing rebellious teen activities on his own, and just like in his infancy, he would also engage in rebellious teen activities collectively, either with his good old friends Tony Nuttall or with his newest friends he had since met during the school years.
It would be very likely to find them doing experiments with substances of suspicious toxicity, not from a chemistry class standpoint, but in the sense of using themselves as guinea pigs. They were not only smoking the classic weeds, but also practicing more dangerous activities, such as inhaling solvents. Besides that, as a part of their extracurricular activities, the students would engage in social work. They were assigned to visit elders to provide them with some company. During those visits, Ian would excuse himself to the bathroom and take the chance to steal a few selected pills he could find stored there. The ones he knew that, in the right dosage,
Or better yet, in the wrong dosage,
could make them high. Things went terribly wrong once when he took an excessive dose of Largactil and had to be revived at the hospital. Speaking of stealing, and considering that money wasn't something that, especially during those times, was abundant inside the pockets of Ian or his mates, it was possible to sometimes find the son of a cop inside liquor and record stores, hiding bottles and discs under a long coat he wore for that purpose. After this phase of rebellion, Ian began using those trench coats in a quite more noble way. Just like with the Caesar's haircut, they also became one of his very recognizable visual trademarks.
Yet on the topic of record stores, here are two related fun facts. The first one is that once in a while, Ian would actually retrieve the discs he had stolen by selling them back to the store.
The second one is that, a few years later, previously to his more known labor involvement with social service, Ian worked for some time at Rare Records in Manchester before his own musical career had even started. The thing is, despite being an excellent student, Ian Curtis decided against proceeding with his studies after high school, searching for regular jobs and an early income instead.
And there was that time Ian auditioned to become a gigolo, but it seems that nothing came out of it. True story. But it wasn't these regular 9-to-5 jobs that turned Ian Curtis into a celebrity.
The starting point of Ian Curtis's jump to fame began on the 20th of July 1976 at the Leicester Free Trade Hall in Manchester. It was on that night that, for the second time at that venue since the 4th of the previous month, the famous punk rock band Sex Pistols, still in their pre-Sid Vicious phase, played.
Speaking of Sid Vicious, and even of that lady next to him, you know perfectly well that someday both will get their own entry right here on the channel, don't you?
We need to remind ourselves that in the conservative and traditional United Kingdom of the 1970s, the so-called punk rock, with all its countercultural attitudes, was quickly becoming a fever among the groups of youngsters unsatisfied with all that etiquette and attitudes of the governing classes that they classified as hypocrites, leading to, according to them, several types of social injustices. As a result, they found in this type of music an opportunity to speak their minds in the most rebellious way possible. The Manchester area, due to its depressing conditions previously described, not only wasn't an exception to the positive reception of this trend, but even became one of its greatest epicenters, with local punk rock bands popping up like mushrooms. One of them would be the notorious Buzzcocks, who, on that night, actually opened for the Pistols. Despite the low attendance that night, several important people in the United Kingdoms and even worldwide future music scene were present at that concert. Amid them was the trio of schoolmates from Salford, another town in the Manchester area, Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook and Terence Mason,
or Barney, Hooky and Terry for friends,
who had actually attended their concert the previous month and since decided, thanks to that specific gig, to form a band. At this concert was also Ian Curtis himself, along with his wife Deborah.
Way more on her later on, so don't worry.
Although Ian wasn't a former schoolmate of theirs, he was still some sort of a concert mate, in the sense that they had all come across each other in previous gigs and shared a few words and experiences.
One of those concerts was definitely not the 4th of June one, as Ian was not present for whatever reason. This was his first Sex Pistols live concert.
As a music lover himself, Ian was also feeling these same aspirations as his gig mates, specifically as a lyricist,
considering how much he enjoyed writing, especially poetry,
and singer. Attending this concert fed this idea into his mind even more deeply while he was watching the local Buzzcocks opening it. He even got the chance to meet them personally later on, which led him to begin conceiving a plan to emulate their ever-growing and notorious success.
During an interaction, all gig mates quickly realized they had all pieces of the puzzle ready to be put together. Barney had the guitar, Hooky had the bass, Terry had the drums, Ian had the pen and the mic, and together they had the fervent will to prevail, to succeed.
And this is how the four comrades got to form a band, the Steve Kittens. According to the legend, this was the first proposed name to the new band by none other than the Buzzcocks themselves. They were even advertised under that name for their first ever gig. However, when it came the time to step on stage, they had already decided to perform as Warsaw instead, based on the recently released song from Ian Curtis's great idol David Bowie's album Low. Name changes haven't ceased here, but Warsaw would still perform under that name for the rest of 1977. The same did not happen concerning their drummers though. Terry Mason seemed to be an underperformer in that regard, so he switched to the agent of the band. After a few attempts to get a fitting drummer, they finally managed to find one in Stephen Morris. Despite Stephen being also from Macclesfield and just slightly younger than Ian, they had never met before. Nevertheless, the most known and definitive formation of the band was finally in full gear.
The year change of 1977 to 1978 also brought another change in the band's name.
When they found out there was already a famous English band called Warsaw Pact, and to avoid any possible confusion, then Warsaw came up with a new name, Joy Division. The name was based on the 1955 historical novel House of Dolls, written by Polish concentration camp survivor Jehiel Denur, more known by his pseudonym Katzetnik 135633. This novel describes the existence of so-called joy divisions, which were nothing more than assigned groups of female concentration camp prisoners in National Socialist Germany, who were primarily used to satisfy the lustful needs of many of their guards.
Let's put things this way.
Moreover, the choice of this name, combined with other factors, such as, for instance, the fact that the band's first EP cover, 1978's An Ideal for a Living, designed by Bernard Sumner himself, as he was also a visual artist, was based on a propaganda poster of the youth division of said party, led to several accusations of them supposedly being sympathizers of such movement. And the media weren't the only ones falling for this innuendo, as even the fans seemed a little confused. An unpleasant phenomenon developed at some point when Joy Division began unintentionally attracting the wrong kind of audience to their shows, which even caused perhaps a couple of riots between the band members and the bald members.
My 2 cents on this matter. One thing is to appreciate said movement in terms of its aesthetics, such as its fashion, its art, its architecture, even its discipline, which was the case with Joy Division, especially Ian Curtis himself, who, as we all know by now, was fascinated with all that ostentation of the ancient empires. Another thing which was obviously condemned by every single member of Joy Division was to appreciate their despicable ideology.
Furthermore, we need to take into account that, at this time, the punk scene was the master and the ruler, and the best way to become the talk of the town was through controversy.
Controversy creates cash.
And whether we liked it or not, during 1977 and 1978, both when they were still going by the name of Warsaw and even during their early days already as Joy Division, they still presented themselves and sounded like one of those many ordinary punk bands. Thanks primarily to Ian Curtis though, this was all about to change.
Intelligent as he was, and the band's frontman we shall never forget, Ian Curtis began realizing that if he wanted to stand out amidst a musical world still under heavy influence from this punk scene, which was nevertheless already entering a quick decline by this point, maybe due to saturation and little artistic originality, he would have to present something unique.
The first change Ian started implementing, as it was the fastest and easiest one to implement, had to do with their visual presentation. The pseudo-punk clothing, especially from their earlier days as Warsaw, was replaced by formal clothing, typically used by the bourgeois and capitalist classes that anarchistic punks criticized so much. So, through this kind of twist of fate, the act of rebelling against the punks by dressing the way they despised so much turned Joy Division, by the hand of Ian Curtis, into the true rebels amongst the rebels.
And that made them unique right away.
But the most significant difference, the one turning Joy Division into those definitive pioneers of the so-called post-punk scene, which would peak especially during the following decades and lead to the creation of countless new music styles of the same family, such as goth, new wave and shoegaze, and also of several new bands publicly admitting their Joy Division influence, was its new artistic direction, very bold and experimental. Poetically speaking, Ian's lyrics, contrary to the commonly energetic and chaotic lyrics of post-punk, were also becoming way colder and somber, which we now know were nothing more than the written manifestation of the metamorphosis occurring at the level of his soul, which was becoming progressively more tortured. But apparently, his bandmates, focused on producing music, seemed to be unaware of all that, perhaps believing that was just a poetic way Ian had come up with to express his art.
Or simply too much reading and consequent influence of his favorite pessimistic writers and philosophers.
The only thing they did, along with their producers, was accompany Ian's lyrics and his always evolving baritone voice the best way they seem fit with their instruments and production techniques. This caused them to sound colder and somber as well, which, before they even knew it, ended up carving the typical sound and attitudes of the emerging post-punk scene of the years to come. However, the ones closer to Ian in his personal life and even the media looked slightly more worried about these new themes found in Ian Curtis's lyrics. To the former, Ian would calm them down, coming up with some excuse.
Or not even bothering with that, and just evading any possible questioning.
To the latter, according to his own words during interviews, he would claim his lyrics were open to interpretation. In any case, the debut of these new post-punk attitudes would be really showcased on their also debuting 1979 LP album, Unknown Pleasures, an album with a new sound and also a legendary cover. This would end up being the only Joy Division LP released during Ian Curtis's lifetime. Joy Division was starting to reach never-before-seen levels of popularity, with an increasing number of concert dates, even in other European countries such as Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and Germany. More lines and peaks in music magazines and even sporadic TV appearances. Feeling they were getting closer to stardom, the boys began working on their second LP album, named Closer, scheduled to be released in 1980.
It's the second time today I'm making a pun with Closer.
For that year, there were also plans on the table for a proper European tour and another even more ambitious one in, of all places, the US of A. The European tour was soon cancelled though. As for the US tour, well, it would end up happening in a way.
But in very unexpected circumstances. Anyway, we must address that one later on.
Needless to say, but considering how both Ian and the remaining band members were still dependent on regular jobs to support themselves, this double life started to take its toll. Particularly in the case of Ian, it was becoming harder and harder for him to reconcile the trinomial professional life plus family life plus life on the road. The first element to fully collapse will be his regular professional life, when, late in the summer of 1979, both Ian and his boss agreed that he wasn't being able to get the job properly done anymore.
Believe it or not, this was far from being the biggest of problems in Ian Curtis's life. The wounds in his soul were getting more severe, mainly due to two other distinct factors.
Despite many people being oblivious to this,
quite often even the other band members,
the success of Ian Curtis as the leader of the Joy Division band,
that is, Ian Curtis, the myth,
was in direct contrast with the lack of success of Ian Curtis, the civil servant, husband, and later on, father. And to better understand this last part, let's leave Ian Curtis the myth for now and go back to Ian Curtis the human.
Being a natural poet, it would be expected that Ian was the typical romantic youngster of 1,000 inspirational nymphs from a tender age. However, we have already established long ago that Ian Curtis was not a normal and predictable individual. After just one serious romantic relationship during his school days that ended up not lasting forever, Ian would discover not long thereafter who he thought to be the true love of his life.
Ian Curtis met Deborah Woodruff, who was about 5 months younger, when she was still the girlfriend of his best friend Tony Nuttall, who introduced the two of them. During their romance, they would visit Ian at his house and would even sometimes use the privacy of his bedroom to make out, away from the eyeballs of everyone.
But Ian's.
The relationship between Tony and Deborah didn't last long, but she kept in touch with Ian, as he was now part of her circle of friends as well. As time went on and they began finding a lot of things in common, they ended up initiating a romantic relationship in late December 1972 during, just imagine, a David Bowie concert they attended together in Stratford. They were both 16. After getting engaged in April 1974, they would marry the following year on the 23rd of August, when Ian had just recently turned 19 and Deborah, now Deborah Curtis, was still 18. The couple's first official home would be in Chadderton, also in Greater Manchester, before they moved to their most famous house in Barton Street, back to good old Macclesfield. In both houses, Ian insisted on having one room fully dedicated to his literary creations, which would become known as his writing room. There, he would enjoy the odd comfort of his quasi-solitude, accompanied only by his indispensable pack of Marlboros, his pen, the paper, whose already inked pieces would be put inside an always handy plastic bag, and, most of all, his genius creativity and strong will to freely express his thoughts. It was there, where he used to answer his life's calling and create his art, listening to the echoes hailing from the confines of his own soul. In Chatterton, Ian decided to paint the walls of the writing room blood red. However, after it dried, it looked more pinkish than bloody. In Macclesfield, the new version of the writing room would gain a blue hue that would stick this time, to the point where this room was now often labeled the Blue Room.
I know that due to the monochromatic nature of this presentation, it's not possible to be aware of this, but you will have to trust my words. These walls were indeed blue.
During the early years, the married life of Ian and Debbie seemed to go quite normally, within the limited possibilities the Manchester area had to offer to its natives. Both were working boring dead-end jobs for their aspirations. Money wasn't abundant, but still enough to pay the bills and the Marlboroughs, and Ian Curtis was yet to become the myth. After turning into the myth and witnessing his career flourishing, especially during the entire year of 1979, the year where, let's remember, Joy Division's first LP came out, the biggest irony is how this was also the year where the deep contrast between the brightness of Ian Curtis the myth and the darkness of Ian Curtis the human could be noticed the most. For example, already in January, Ian was diagnosed with what would arguably become his greatest challenge in life.
But as you have gotten used to by now, more on that later.
This terrible news would drop like a bomb on the one who, very soon, was about to become a daddy. In April, the couple's only child, Natalie Curtis, was born. And it was probably around this time that Ian finally realized what he has got himself into, by noticing that, starting now, it would almost be impossible to reconcile the myth and the human. It was probably around this time that Ian realized everything was happening too fast.
Both in terms of his mythological life, but even more in terms of his human one.
The stage responsibilities of Ian Curtis the myth in relation to his fans have finally been supplanted by the home responsibilities of Ian Curtis the human in relation to his now increased family. Later in the summer, as already mentioned, Ian Curtis would lose his job as a civil servant, which put even more pressure under Deborah's shoulders. She now had the double duty of taking care of their baby child and supporting the household as well, considering that the money Ian was making with the band was still not enough, despite JD being growing a lot in popularity. This made the couple's expectations also grow along, allowing them to envision a way brighter future likely right around the corner.
But the couple's greatest pressure would arrive via another source. Natalie was far from being the only third element suddenly appearing in the couple's picture.
It will still be in that year of 1979 that, allegedly in October and not long after losing his job, Ian Curtis would meet Annick Honoré, a 21-year-old Belgian who worked full-time at the Embassy of Belgium in London. During her spare time, she would also assume the role of a music journalist interviewing bands for a Belgian magazine. Thanks to this position, she would act as some kind of a bridge that allowed several British bands to play in Belgium, just like Joy Division themselves on a couple of occasions. Annick was a JD fan and had been already attending their gigs in London and Manchester areas.
And here is another proof of how Joy Division had definitely distanced themselves from their ordinary punk roots, considering how even their groupies seemed to be attracted to more intelligent, educated and sensitive guys compared to all other ordinary groupies.
Honoré was able to get an interview with Joy Division, and the mutual interest between Annick and Ian quickly developed as a result. Everything happened just too fast. When they noticed, Ian Curtis and Annick Honoré were deeply in love. More recently, according to his wife's account. Ian had been displaying controlling attitudes for years at that point, in regard to possible interactions of Deborah with other men.
And now, all of a sudden, the insecure and jealous Ian was living a romantic and sexual affair with another woman, as if he had just been projecting on his wife the fears of his most intimate desires.
But, according to an also later account of Annick, the mistress, she defended until her premature death in 2014 that their relationship was just platonic. Romantic or platonic, the truth is that Annick deeply transformed Ian's mood and the way he looked at life. He began spending less time with the other bandmates to be with her. She was even able to change his dietary habits, convincing Ian to turn vegetarian just like she was.
Even though it seemed his vegetarianism was just presential, as when she wasn't around, Ian would resume his old eating habits once again.
Ian was living a dichotomy. Tormented by his biological imperative, he couldn't understand how was he able to love two women at the same time, in such a different, but equally valid, way. In a society constantly trying to impose on him the idea that the monogamous lifestyle was the only one that could make his soul live in never-ending tranquility. When he wasn't listening to such a society, he saw no problems in loving Debbie, the woman in this whole world who seemed to better understand Ian Curtis the human like nobody else, while at the same time loving equally but differently Annick, the woman in this whole world who seemed to better understand Ian Curtis the myth like nobody else. When he listened to them, however, Ian Curtis, the human, felt deep shame and embarrassment concerning what he was doing to his daughter's mother, to his family. As for Ian Curtis, the myth, based on the marital crisis he was going through, that boy took the chance to write the song that would become the most well-succeeded and famous in the history of Joy Division, Love Will Tear Us Apart, which will be released as a single and even get its own official music video. Just like with the more and more apparent unlikelihood of the harmonious merging between Ian Curtis the human and Ian Curtis the myth, realizing how we couldn't live this double love lifestyle with both the muses who understood him the better, each one regarding their respective sides, he knew he got some important decision to take.
That's when he just asked his old friend and confidant, Bernard Sumner, to take the decision for him.
Sumner, who, besides being a musician, visual artist and apparently also involved with hypnosis,
the damn dude could do everything.
Having even tried to hypnotize Ian at some point.
I want you to go further back in time to before you were born. What can you see? It's reading. What are you reading? A book about laws.
Obviously refused to take the decision that was up to Ian Curtis and only Ian Curtis to take. And this made Ian dive even deeper into the abyss of his own doubts.
But the pains inside Ian's soul, for quite some time now, were walking hand in hand with certain physical pains, which, as a result, would feed the former even more, in a terrible, vicious circle, spinning towards the more and more imminent, right to the bottom of a gargantuan pit, the pit of hell.
As aforementioned, in January 1979, Ian Curtis was officially diagnosed with a condition which, in his specific case, not only was very severe, but kept intensifying as time went on, especially in his last year alive.
The condition I'm referring to was none other than epilepsy.
This was just the confirmation of something Ian was already very suspicious about. Epilepsy wasn't exactly a novel concept in the life of Ian Curtis. Even during his youth, Ian would sometimes already have the impression of his spirit coming out of his body, according to his own words. However, due to the often present recreational abuse of certain substances by Ian and his friends at the time, the true causes of such a feeling could easily be misdiagnosed. As part of his duty as a civil servant, Ian would often deal with epileptic clients who, due to their condition, had trouble integrating into the job market. One particular client would end up causing quite an impact on Ian's life forever, when, one day, she had a seizure during an appointment with Ian, who wasn't sure how to react in front of the vision of a desperate mother trying to soften her daughter's apparent total loss of any kind of self-control. Not long thereafter, and extremely touched by this episode, Ian called her home to know how she was doing, only to learn that the girl, unfortunately, had passed away as a result of this condition. Ian Curtis, the sensitive human, became absolutely devastated. Ian Curtis, the opportunistic myth, once again, took advantage of the situation and wrote a song based on and as a homage to the girl, She Has Lost Control, another one of the most famous Joy Division songs included in the Unknown Pleasures album.
By now, Ian was still far from imagining that he too was about to begin being tormented by this hell, which arguably would also become a key factor in the premature end of his life.
From early 1979 onwards, Ian began suffering similar fits himself, with them getting stronger, more frequent, more energy draining, and more brutal with time.
Unmercifully, they chose no time nor place to occur.
They could happen when Ian was home alone, they could happen when Ian was on a road trip between gigs, and, of course, they could even happen when Ian was on stage.
Something, by the way, very likely to occur due to certain kinds of strobe lights, often used in this type of live performances, that can easily cause a seizure in epileptics.
But we should be asking the following. What about Ian Curtis the myth? How did he react to this dreadful blow to the life of his human counterpart? Yes, you got it right. His geniality did the usual.
It seems that, once again, he made things, somehow and in a certain way, work in his favor.
It's impossible to make a video about Ian Curtis without talking about his bizarre way of dancing.
To say the least.
Between intros and verses, choruses and bridges, while his baritone voice paused to make way for the gloomy melody of the other instruments, Ian would accompany their dark magic with the clumsy and erratic movement of his limbs and the hypnotic and stunned expression of his face, as if, all of a sudden, some rebellious spirit was possessing him and submitting him to the spirit's own will, totally making him
lose control.
Analyzing it deeply, we are left with the feeling that Ian Curtis, the myth, with such an odd dance, was doing nothing more than just emulating the crippling condition of Ian Curtis the human, as if, as a true musical bully, he just resigned to it, laughing at himself in this odd way. The ones more frivolous with their analysis even baptized the Ian Curtis style of dancing as the epileptic dance, also resigning to their lack of a real explanation behind this peculiar motricity.
As for the most curious ones, they have come up with several theories. But let's be honest, the true reason or reasons went to the grave with Ian Curtis. All we are left with is pure speculation.
According to his wife, Ian was just clumsy in many of his endeavors, and the lack of skills for dancing were just another display of that. Even during their wedding reception, according to her, Ian was already dancing in that manner away from the stages and the spotlights. Some believe Ian Curtis had just based his frenetic way of dancing on his great idol Iggy Pop and then just added his personal clumsy touch, which to a degree corroborates Deborah's theory. Others think that style of dancing was the genuine way the tormented
and one of a kind
Ian Curtis had to introspectively, and when in not in need to borrow his voice to the show, get rid of his pressures, frustrations, questions and pains of his soul, temporarily surrendering it to the melancholic and dim sonority of his songs, which also emulated perfectly the way Ian truly felt inside.
After all, for many people, dancing is a hell of a therapy.
For others, quicker in their evaluations, this was simply a mix of all the aforementioned factors.
What about me? Well, I'm gonna say just the following. The ones who think that Ian Curtis, the myth, by emulating the feats of Ian Curtis, the human, was just trying to be some kind of a sadomasochistic bully, could not be further from the truth.
I'd like them to understand that by imitating the movements that are similar to the feats in the form of a dance, Ian Curtis, the myth, was just trying to confuse the audience, not in an attempt to deceive them, but as a way to, in case Ian Curtis, the human, suddenly stepped on stage and quote-unquote gifted everyone with the sad spectacle of a true epileptic seizure, the visual contrast between both Ian's way of being wouldn't be as negatively impactful. In other words, by imitating his rocking epileptic movements, Ian Curtis, the myth, was in fact not bullying but protecting Ian Curtis, the human, at least from the possible mocking of the audience.
But this is just my humble opinion. What would be yours? But if Ian Curtis, the myth, seemed to be able to protect Ian Curtis, the human, from being mocked by the fans, at least a bit, nothing else was being able to protect him from the aggravated state of his own condition, which was getting more and more debilitating and heartbreaking.
It was really evident that Ian, when away from the spotlights and from his particular on-stage tap dancing, was underperforming in terms of living a normal everyday life. He was extremely afraid of even the simple act of picking his daughter in his arms, fearing having an abrupt fit and dropping her by accident. Evidently, this affected the establishment of a stronger bond between father and daughter. His epilepsy was also one of the reasons,
Perhaps the main one,
why Ian began underperforming at work, leading to his dismissal. The illness was largely affecting not only his regular professional life, but also his complex artistic passion. As much as Ian Curtis, the myth, protected Ian Curtis, the human, this protection wasn't reciprocated. The human's unconscious dancing on the floor was definitely harming the myth's conscious dancing on his feet.
in other words, Ian Curtis's performance on stage was becoming deeply affected as well.
Even commonplace tasks got compromised as a result of this new cross Ian had to bear. For instance, Ian Curtis had finally gotten his driver's license.
More under familiar pressure than thanks to a true desire for driving. Let's just admit.
However, after his diagnosis, it was clear he had to quit that too for obvious reasons. Let's also admit another obvious fact. The unruly lifestyle of Ian Curtis between concerts and pubs wasn't certainly helping in any way. Even after having all doctors in his ear always repeating the same, his sleeping pattern was very irregular due to his life on the road, when he wasn't simply not even sleeping at all or very little, not to mention that, likely due to the constant pressures in his life affecting his moods in an insistent and invading way, Ian wasn't exactly battling that hard against some bad habits such as alcohol and cigarettes, which probably helped him to relax and forget about his miseries, if only very briefly.
Even so, and in another one of the countless ironies happening in the life of Ian Curtis, the most harmful substances running through his veins weren't even the ones doctors were advising against, but rather the ones they were prescribing him.
in an attempt to mitigate the effects of the illness in Curtis's daily life. And let's never forget that this was back when medical knowledge about epilepsy was still light years behind ours. Ian was almost being used as just guinea pig.
A little like back when he was using recreational drugs as a teenager.
Different sorts of experimental cocktails were being prescribed to him in the hope of finding the magic pill in a true trial and error scenario. That is, the same Ian Curtis who used to steal pills from old ladies' bathroom medicine cabinets was now accessing his own, hoping that those pills he was swallowing wouldn't make him high, but rather relieve the greatest of his evils. But such a relief seemed never to come. As for the terrible side effects of such a compound of experimental compounds, though, those ones were coming in droves. Ian Curtis was constantly affected by mood swings, as if he was suffering from a chemically induced bipolar disorder, even more accentuated depressing feelings and thoughts, drowsiness that would last the whole day and cause him to fall asleep in the most inappropriate of places, just like, for example, over his desk during work hours, among several other side effects. As the old saying goes, if the disease doesn't kill you, the cure will. Ian didn't let that happen.
In the worst fashion possible, of course.
However, according to modern medical accounts, it would be guaranteed that had Ian not had the kind of ending he did, the poisonous to the brain and even lethal combinations of drugs being prescribed to him would end up, sooner or later, performing that job for him. Now, take this poisonous and lethal combination and mix it with the poisonous and lethal combination of general events in the life of Ian Curtis, the human. A debilitating illness, forcing him to take tons of medicine with dire side effects, especially to his brain.
Or, in another words, his soul.
A rushed marriage, now on the verge of ruin.
By this time, Deborah had already filed for divorce.
An entire family crumbling right in front of his very light-colored eyes. An extramarital affair also crumbling. The constant pressure put on Ian Curtis the Myth to live up to the high standards brought by the ever-growing fame of Joy Division through stellar performances, especially in the upcoming tour in the land of Uncle Sam, and, on top of all that, we shall also not forget the countless hours that Ian spent reading countless lines from his favorite pessimistic and nihilistic celebrities of our history, who spent their lives trying to make us realize that we live in a world devoid of any sense or purpose.
Before this implosive cocktail, which poor soul could maintain control?
And it's in the midst of this chaotic scenario that we reach Saturday, the 17th of May 1980, 2 days away from the ecstatic departure of Joy Division for their first ever tour in another continent. With their divorce pending, the Curtis couple wasn't sharing life together anymore. Deborah was living in the couple's house with their daughter, while Ian was skipping between the home of his parents and the one of Factory Records owner Tony Wilson and his partner.
Factory Records was Joy Division's label, just for the record.
Still, on that day, Ian informed Deborah he was staying at their house for the weekend, as he was supposed to rendezvous with his bandmates the next day to arrange the details of the US tour. Concerning Deborah in particular, she was having a quite busy end of the week, working as a barmaid and waitress for a wedding reception at the nightclub on Friday and Saturday evenings. Deborah dropped Natalie off at her parents' house and was also sleeping there between shifts to be closer to her daughter. Knowing Ian was home, Deborah met with him there on Saturday afternoon between shifts. Ian tried to convince her to bring their daughter to stay with him instead of with her grandparents, but Deborah nixed the idea.
The possibility of Ian having a fit while home with just his baby daughter and no one else to supervise both isn't something pleasant to imagine.
Then Ian asked her to return after the evening shift, so they could talk a little more and a little better. This time, the request was agreed upon. While Deborah was away working on that Saturday evening, Ian Curtis, home alone, watched the UK television debut of Werner Herzog's 1977 movie Stroszek on BBC Two. This might seem like a petty detail at first, when, in fact, taking our context into account, there is nothing ordinary about this motion picture. There is even a good chance that this film played a crucial role in Ian Curtis's fate during those grievous upcoming hours. Stroszek is a semi-biographical movie that tells us the story of Bruno Stroszek, a character played by the German street musician and artist known as Bruno S.
A character that, factually speaking, is more of an extension of the real person than a purely fictitious character.
In real life, Bruno S., who wasn't a legit pro actor, had a certain degree of intellectual and social limitations and spent most of his youth in mental institutions.
So both Bruno S. and his character here, or extension, were also true outcasts.
The story of this movie starts with Bruno, an alcoholic semi-vagabond, being released from prison in Berlin. The first thing he does thereafter is enter a bar, where he meets another outcast in Eva, a prostitute. She gets beaten and humiliated by her pimps, and the same ends up happening with Bruno when he tries to defend her. Determined to find a better life free from all that kind of abuse, they join Bruno's eccentric old neighbor, Scheitz, another outcast, who had been dreaming about living with his nephew Clayton in Wisconsin, and decide to travel to the US in their delusional search for the American dream. In the beginning, things don't go that badly. Bruno finds a job as an auto mechanic with Clayton as his assistant, and Eva starts working as a waitress. Bruno and Eva then acquire a mobile home which they place on Clayton's land. However, this is also the point where the American dream quickly starts to shatter apart, as the household bills keep mounting, even making Eva return to sex work. Unfortunately, not even that is enough to salvage the situation. Fed up with that lifestyle, Eva ends up leaving Bruno and running away to Vancouver on a ride with a bunch of truck drivers. As for the mobile home, it gets repossessed by the bank and is then sold at an auction. Homeless and hopeless, believing the world is basically trolling them big time, they decide to troll the world back, which, in the specific case of Bruno, means going back to the criminal lifestyle. To get revenge for what the bank did to them, Bruno and Scheitz decide to rob a bank using a shotgun. However, when they find out the bank is closed but nevertheless insisting on engaging in some robbery, they end up robbing a nearby barbershop, only to get the pathetic sum of $32 in cash. With that amount, they go shopping at a small store across the street, but the police are quick to arrive, taking only Scheitz under arrest, as they don't even notice Bruno there. Now completely alone and desperate due to witnessing his life going more and more downhill in this authentic American nightmare, Bruno takes the shotgun he used for the robbery, loads his tow truck with beer, and drives erratically, a la Mad Max, along the highway. When he randomly arrives in the small town of Cherokee, North Carolina, the truck breaks. With his disappointment toward life growing, but moved by the thought of avenging it by causing as much chaos as he possibly can to the same universe he believes was responsible for the chaos in his own life, Bruno finds a way to put the truck running alone in circles in a restaurant's parking lot with its engine compartment set on fire. Besides, he finds a small amusement park alongside the road with a ski lift and several attractions where farm animals inside cone-operated booths are conditioned in a Pavlovian way to perform specific repetitive actions in exchange for food that is released upon inserting a coin. One of those animals in particular is a chicken that, by performing its naturally instinctive ground scratching, but on a slippery plate instead, appears to be dancing in a comical and awkward manner. After activating both the ski lift and all the booths, leaving everything in a frenzy, we see Bruno traveling on the ski lift and disappearing on the horizon, only to hear a gunshot seconds later. The movie ends in a tragic-comic way, with a police officer informing his peers through the radio that there was a truck on fire, a lift with a man running in circles, whose switch that turned it off they weren't able to find, and on top of that, they couldn't stop the dancing chicken. This last sentence ended up becoming some sort of a meme and one of the most memorable parts of this film. By the way, it's worth mentioning that director Herzog was absolutely fascinated with chickens, not in a good way, but in the sense of being terrified by what he described as their empty look, as if through it they clearly displayed their vacuous soullessness.
So, a European outcast who used to get abused, mocked and humiliated in his country, and who also happened to be somewhat of a misunderstood artist, travels to the United States in search of a better life. But things quickly go south as he gets once again taken advantage of by everyone surrounding him. His love interest abandons him when he needed her the most. His whole life suddenly crumbles, and as a result, he decides the best thing to do is to just abandon this cruel world in response. And there is that kind of robotic chicken that routinely dances awkwardly for our amusement in exchange for some potential small reward. This is the movie Ian Curtis watched while he emptied an entire jar of coffee and was already on the verge of preparing some more. Now, just do the math.
Already in the earliest hours of the 18th, Deborah, as promised, returned from her extenuating work, and then the estranged couple finally had the talk. Ian asked Deborah to drop the divorce proceedings. However, after hearing that he had talked to Annick that evening, an irritated Deborah had even fewer doubts about her decision. Furthermore, Ian feared that, while he was overseas, she would meet someone else.
Here we have those same projections once again.
With Ian getting less and less reasonable in his speech,
we shall never forget that an entire jar of coffee was behind it,
and fearing he would work himself into a fit,
something that apparently he could do on demand, if under more stressful situations, or if he just wanted to turn all attention to himself.
Deborah offered to spend the night with him.
This was the reason, or rather, the excuse she gave, but in my opinion, deep down, it seemed Deborah was just hoping they could find a way together to save their marriage somehow. But what do I know?
What I do know is that Deborah left the house temporarily to go tell her parents about this new change of plans.
What I also don't know is why she didn't use the phone. What I also don't know is why she didn't use the phone for that.
But upon returning, Ian had already changed his mind, strongly insisting that she left him alone. He also insisted that she should only return home after 10 a.m, when Ian had already left to go catch the train to Manchester to meet with his bandmates.
Feeling that by looking at Ian's face, he was in no danger of suffering a fit, and allied to the fact that she just felt really exhausted from work and in no mood for arguments, Deborah agreed. Unbeknownst to her at that moment, when she passed through the house's front door, both on her way out and then on her way in, upon returning, Deborah Curtis would become the last person to witness Ian Curtis breathing, and also the first to see Ian Curtis not breathing any longer.
And now Ian Curtis found himself, as ironically the title of one of his songs says, in a lonely place. It's impossible to know with precision what went through the mind of that poor soul in these hours of solitary agony, but a few hints were left behind. Based on them, we know that, besides the entire jar of coffee, Ian made himself even more coffee and emptied an entire bottle of whiskey as well. We know that, perhaps while consuming all this toxic amount of beverage, Ian listened to 1977's The Idiot, the debut album of his longtime idol Iggy Pop, whose title came from Dostoevsky's book of the same name. As we all know, Dostoevsky was also a huge literary inspiration for Ian Curtis. This book tells us the story of a young epileptic prince whose kindness, simplicity and honesty were often confused with stupidity and poor insight.
And here it comes. More math for you to do.
We also know that, perhaps while soullessly drinking and listening to The Idiot, Ian took his daughter's Natalie picture off the wall and one of his wedding pictures off a drawer, while looking at the happy facials of a bygone age expressed by the two most crucial females in his adult life. Ian wrote Debbie a letter whose content made it seem more like an intimate letter than a goodbye one. The exact content of this letter was never shown to the public. However, according to the widow herself, we know that Ian expressed a desire to be dead, but nothing in his words seemed to indicate he wished to take care of that himself. He also talked about his love for the two of them and his hatred for Annick.
Which, let's be honest about this last part, didn't seem to be sincere at all.
The problem was that, according to him, he didn't want to sound cruel by telling her he didn't want to see her anymore, even if it could save his marriage. When Ian finished this letter, full of apparent contradictions,
let me remind you again, it was written under the influence of a lot of pressure, caffeine and heavy drunkenness.
In his own words, it was already dawn and he could hear the birds singing.
The birds were singing outside, but inside, the voice of Ian Curtis, the singer, was about to become silent forever.
Even before reaching his 24th birthday, and with an entire life supposedly still ahead of him, albeit a life that seemed to be escaping between his fingers, Ian Curtis, the spinal cord of the post-punk pioneer band Joy Division, just like Bruno Strozek, decided it was now his turn to escape from it, and it was there, in the knot of a kitchen clothes rack, that Ian Curtis found his way out. He too had finally lost control.
There are a few things, in fact nothing, that I dislike more than being the bringer of bad news for you, but heard during the day that Ian Curtis of Joy Division has died, and beyond this I don't know any details about it at all, but obviously our sympathies are due to the other members of the band, but most particularly to Ian's family and friends.
The voice of Ian Curtis was silenced forever, but life had to go on for those who used to coexist with him. Not only life, but the show had to go on as well, and the show definitely still went on for Ian's bandmates. They kept the promise to end Joy Division if any member quit, but they solved the problem by just starting a new band. Bernard Sumner, the new frontman, Peter Hook, Stephen Morris, and now the latter's girlfriend Gillian Gilbert as well, formed New Order just a few months after Ian's departure, whose sound went on a less melancholic and more electronic direction, dictated by the new decade.
Despite this, they still released a couple of songs written by Ian during the latest days of Joy Division.
New Order would achieve even greater commercial success compared to Joy Division's short lifespan, especially during the 80s and the 90s.
Oh, and the so coveted US tour would end up happening for the lads still in that year of 1980, but now under the New Order denomination, of course.
As for his family, Deborah Curtis published a book in 1995 sharing her memories of her life with Ian Curtis, Touching from a Distance, which would inspire photographer and movie director Anton Corbijn to release an Ian Curtis biopic in 2007 titled Control.
But I'm sure this is something you have already figured out by now.
and let me take this chance to highly recommend this movie, which, besides containing a few artistic liberties that were taken,
Something happening with 110% of all biopics out there.
it's still an excellent account of the tormented life of Ian Curtis. As a fun fact, the actor who gave life to Ian Curtis in the movie, Sam Riley, upon meeting on the set the actress who played Annick Honoré, Alexandra Maria Lara, would end up marrying her and building a family with her.
Am I the only one who finds really curious the fact that in real life he married his mistress rather than his wife?
Natalie Curtis, the daughter of Ian Curtis,
Who, as you can see, couldn't look more like a female version of him.
would grow up to become a woman who, inspired by the lenses of not only the already mentioned Anton Corbijn, but also some other professional photographers who produced so many famous pictures of his dad, such as Kevin Cummins, Philippe Carli, and Robert Ellis, would become a pro photographer herself, despite opting to live a somewhat low-profile life away from the limelight.
Fortunately, the lives of the ones who had lived alongside Ian Curtis moved on, but we must still address the elephant in the room. Ian Curtis's precocious departure raises more questions than answers. Questions that remain unanswered for 40 plus years now.
Was Ian's act premeditated or impulsive? Did he already know he would never land on American soil? Was the note to Deborah just a mere confusion of scribbled ideas coming from a tremendously altered state of consciousness, or a true goodbye letter after all? How much weight the viewing of Stroszek had on Ian's final judgment, if any? Did Ian get introspective throughout the viewing and draw some parallels between the life of its main character and his own? Or was the airing of that film on that particular night just a mere coincidence, and Ian had already decided beforehand what he was about to do?
My theory, which is nothing more than just that, a theory, is that Ian Curtis had already decided, in case Deborah refused to drop the divorce proceedings, he would very likely advance with what he ended up doing. This is, for me, the true reason he wanted to stop by home and talk to Deborah. I mean, despite already having Plan S in mind, he was still trying his best to find any reason to be dissuaded from following such a plan. However, as we know, the conversation unfortunately didn't go well at all. And on top of that, Ian felt extremely tense and overwhelmed with the US tour, fearing the American crowd, not knowing him that well yet, would mock him in case he had a fit on stage, or even when he started dancing in his bizarrely unique way, not to mention his simple fear of flying, to the point he wanted to travel to the US by ship, which was refused by his entourage for being just too impractical. To make matters worse, due to the similarities between the plot of Stroszek and his own current situation, his worries concerning the US tour reached their all-time peak, and his impaired judgment also reached its all-time peak after a jar and a half of coffee and a whole bottle of whiskey, which were an even more implosive combination when mixed with his usual anti-epileptic medication. For me, Ian was drinking gallons of coffee and alcohol in order to provide him the needed courage to advance with his final plan. And last but not least, there was that rope from the kitchen clothes rack, which seemed to be looking and smiling at him as some sort of invitation to take advantage of the convenient solution it was offering him, i.e. the same path some of his past idols also took when they were themselves still in their 20s. What about your personal theory? Do you agree with mine? Do you disagree? Do you think you have a better one, maybe?
But we still have to face the most important question of them all, the one that seems inconceivable to us. How is it possible that, in spite of all the signs, no one could predict, and more important yet, prevent Ian Curtis from accepting the rope's offering? How is it possible that no one, especially his bandmates, paid detailed attention to Ian Curtis's lyrics and their ever-growing gloomy topics and tone? It seems that the one closer to cracking these codes was his mistress, Annick Honoré, who at one point even commented with his bandmates that if things continued this way, Ian would one day end his life.
Perhaps they thought she was just dramatizing.
Because let's be honest, and playing devil's advocate for a moment, maybe they thought it was just his controversial way of artistic expression, just like the National Socialist symbolism associated with Joy Division, not necessarily expressing how Ian truly felt inside. We can't forget that the melancholic and somber image the public had of Ian Curtis, especially the myth, was mainly built based on the nowadays iconic black and white photos of him in magazines of the specialty, which at the time conveniently published most of them in monochrome. This greatly differed from the image his bandmates had of him, mainly due to the fact they had the privilege of having access to Ian Curtis the human as well. According to them, and contrary to the sad, sorrowful and frowning image, the Ian Curtis they knew and with whom they coexisted was relatively sociable, playful, and, as opposed to the first image of Ian Curtis we imagine when we close our eyes, would even dress colorfully quite often.
And now I urge you to rewind these last few seconds and rewatch them, as this is probably the only time you will ever witness vivid color on this channel.
Would all this color be nothing but an act? The truth is that no color could hide the fact that this wasn't even the first time Ian had tried to do it.
Not even the second.
The first time he used the kitchen knife, albeit he was too drunk, and it isn't clear if this was a real S-word attempt or just a stupid moment. Then, on the 7th of the previous month of the ultimate attempt, Ian had already tried the S-word via an O-word of phenobarbital, which granted him a trip to the hospital for a stomach pump. This was the action that contributed the most to Ian leaving his home to go live for a while under the supervision of Tony Wilson, as mentioned previously.
Oh, and just for the record, the very next day, after having his stomach pumped, he gave a concert. Although he was just able to sing a couple of songs. Still impressive nonetheless.
Unlike the following successful attempt, it's also not clear if this attempt was legit or just another acute cry for help. Regardless, the people who surrounded him should have been able to be more vigilant.
Which I know is better said than done, when even the supposed experts at the time ruled Ian out of being prone to further S-words attempts.
And we are left with a final question. What about Ian Curtis himself? How was his aftermath? What legacy does he leave us with? Is he going down in history as a great singer? Not quite. Let's be honest. He wasn't even that great of a singer. If anything, he knew way better what to sing rather than how to sing. Is he going down in history as a great dancer? All I can say is that unique isn't necessarily synonymous with even good, let alone great. Is he going down in history as a great instrument player? On the rare occasions a guitar was put in his hands, Ian hated to play it, so nope. Is he going down in history as a great writer? This one he would, had he not aborted the mission of keep living.
And this is how I wrap the video up, leaving you reflecting on the true legacy Ian Curtis leaves us with, in the form of the 3 main life lessons he inadvertently taught us.
First lesson, Ian Curtis taught us that being as rebellious as we want and can be is still no excuse for not dressing neatly and looking good. Second lesson. Ian Curtis taught us that there is no problem in men also crying, at least sometimes. And the last and most important lesson, Ian Curtis taught us that we can't indeed stop the dancing chicken. At least, not this one, because this one dances to celebrate his own legacy. Ian Curtis, the human, may be long gone, but Ian Curtis, the myth, that one will forever be alive and well, uncontrollably dancing to the sound of our own heartfelt heartbeats. Thanks for watching, and until next time, if I feel like it.